more rounds of additional questions, but we'll see how it goes. The point is make it inclusive and fluid and all that. So, all right, well, let's go with folks who are here. So Ellie, you want to?
Well, hello, everybody. I'm Ellie Noam, the director for the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation. We are been around for a while. We have about for those of you who are new to these events, we've had 75 books or more. We have continuous series of conferences, workshop, webinar. And this is the webinar that series that Bill Drake has been organizing. Bill is our director for international studies. He put this webinar together, the whole series. Thank you very much. Also want to thank Jason Buckwitz, our executive director who manages the whole thing. Thank you, Jason. The underlying issue before us today is the quality of information, disinformation, fake news, hate speech, etc. How to deal with them. It deserves a discussion. It deserves the positions of all stakeholders. This includes the platforms themselves, about which we will be talking. But since they're not here on the panel itself, I hope that they or others in the audience will speak up in the discussion. The issue itself has been dealt with on national levels, on regional levels, and now the UNESCO comes in and produces a guideline to governments around the world. It's produced in what I believe is for UN organizations at warp speed, a template of regulations and processes. Version 2 is still the governing version, but version 3 is, I just heard, is coming up in a few days. And the final guidelines will be coming in still this year. 29 single-space pages with extraordinary detail guidelines of processes and regulations. I will just to give you the flavor, read you one or two. For example, the regulatory system of countries should establish standardized reporting mechanisms and formats. Ideally, reports should be made annually in a machine-readable format. Or another example, platforms should put into place well-funded and staffed support programs for content moderators to minimize harm caused to them through their recurring exposure to violent or disturbing content while at work. So this is a UN organization that tells government how to kind of protect, how to tell platforms how to protect their own staff. And so the question is, why are we doing this? Why is the UNESCO doing this? Who is pushing this in particular? Now, of course, to take the big picture here, rather than get into the specifics of each of these recommendations and guidelines, of course, we don't like disinformation. Who would? But we should also keep in mind that even worse could be to empower some governmental agencies or some private companies to determine what is the truth. We like to always to believe that our views are the truth, or could we otherwise? But suppose the decisions of what is truthful and what is correct and factual are made by a government that is run by another party. Yes, we could lose elections. Most issues are not black and white. And some of the same people who have preached under postmodernism that facts are subjective are now advocating that there is room only for objective facts. And some of this is discussed in a great book on hate speech that I want to show, and I'm very pleased to mention that the author Nadine Strawson happens to be also my wife. So I think she is already, for those of you who are interested in the topic, read the book. Even better, buy the book.
This is our first advertisement in a session, Ellie.
All right. Now, here are some questions and bullet points to spark and provoke a discussion by the panelists and by the audience. There's a history here with UNESCO. We all know this. The United States has left it twice. There's the history of a new world information order, a new world cultural order, etc. Support for licensing of journalists. So this is, is this simply a continuation of UNESCO's to some people, free press, to some people, anti-Western, anti-American, anti-free market economy bias? Question mark. Another question. The guidelines basically urge governments to crack down on social media platforms so that the platforms, will crack down on information. At the same time, they complain, everybody complains about the power of these platforms. But isn't this a fundamental contradiction? You really does one really want these commercial companies to become global censors and arbiters of what is true and factual? Third question. In most countries, online policy isn't handled by ministries of education or science or culture. So why is on the international level, UNESCO, science, culture, education? UNESCO already has a huge area of responsibilities. It's already overstretched. And yet it got into this, and it got into it in extraordinary detail. Shouldn't it stay with what it does best, education and cultural heritage, which it does so well, and leave online regulation to others? Fourth question, the objectives, definitions, and recommendations are often, of the guidelines, are often so vague and non-specific. Couldn't they give authoritarian governments legitimacy in controlling information and content under the guise of protecting their publics against disinformation and hate? I'm reminded of the government of Singapore, which has in the past been using laws of defamation to crack down on its critics and the press by labeling critical comments as defamation and therefore subject to draconian penalties. And last question. The guidelines support crackdown on content that is illegal under international human rights law, but one must read the footnotes. What exactly are international human rights laws that make it illegal? The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, Articles 19 and 20, don't really support restrictions on things like anti-vax or anti-climate change or lies by political candidates. So these guidelines, in effect, broaden the scope of permissible restrictions. Are we okay with it? So those are my questions, and I will pass this on to Bill and the panel. I note with satisfaction that virtually everybody here has some Columbia connection. Of course, Bill with a PhD at Columbia and being with us. I think that what else, some of the other, Ellison has participated in one of our activities. David at CITI by being an author. Laura has a master's degree from the Columbia Law School. And David has published a major book a few years ago with the Columbia University. So thank you very much, all of you. Take it away, Bill.
Okay, thanks, Ellie, for that detailed background. I'm going to welcome everybody. I'm going to back up a little bit and contextualize things a little. First, just to say, great to have you all here. This is the sixth meeting of the series that we're doing on global digital governance. The videos and transcripts of the previous sessions are all available on the website for the series that was included in the announcement. Our next meeting will be in 4 weeks on Wednesday, May 24th. That will be the last one of the semester. So let me just take a couple of minutes to background this thing and then launch some conversation with our distinguished panel. Just to put this into historical context, as being a scholar of international communications history, I want to do. If you look at the evolution of things over time, interstate cooperation on matters of infrastructure, networks and services, despite the political differences and industry interests and so on, have always kind of proceeded to some extent because there were strong incentives for states to cooperate and reach international arrangements together on rules of the game. So you have the international telecom regime, radio regime, satellites regime, so on. cooperation on substantive content of communication exchanged over networks has always been more difficult and limited in some respects. For point-to-point and mass communications, there's arguably less functional incentive for states to have shared rules. And of course, there's great differences among states in their political orientations towards different types of speech. So this has always been an issue. If you look at the evolution of some of these international arrangements, like the telecom regime, it gives rights to states to interrupt, inspect, and terminate international communications. This is all written into the treaties. The spectrum agreements have, and satellites have language on harmful interference and jamming and prior consent, etc. League of Nations, UN have tried to have various kinds of provisions pertaining to particular kinds of substantive information, but that's often been more difficult. So the challenge of cooperating on matters of content around communication have just been a kind of leitmotif of international governance for many years. And of course, the internet changed all this and turbocharged a lot of the issues and made it more complicated still. And social media in particular has done that. I mean, much of the debate has, as Ellie alluded to, been very much focused around harms, the notion of social harms that require governmental intervention in some manner to deal with hate speech, disinformation, etc. There's been less focus, I would argue, on kind of empowering aspects of social media, which has often been very important to actors who lack access to other channels of expression and assembly, especially in non-democratic countries, which I find that asymmetry a little troubling. I mean, there should be a much more human rights orientation in my view. But anyway, many countries are beginning to adopt policies here. And we're seeing other international efforts. We've seen just yesterday, the European Union, the Commission came out and identified the online platforms and search engines that must comply with its more rigorous rules under the Digital Services Act. There are 19 very new acronyms for us all, 19 very large online platforms. Those are VLOPs and very large online search engines, VLOSs. So 4 of which are Alphabet, 2 of which are Meta, 15 are US, 2 are EU, 2 are China. Interesting asymmetry there. But so the EU's been very leaning forward and proactive in trying to set international rules of the game here within the European Union's space. And now, yes, we have UNESCO with its 193 members based in Paris, longstanding key focal point of international communication discussions within the United Nations system, with its history, of course, as Ellie alluded to, late 70s, early 80s, the New World Information Order, the Convention on Diversity, Cultural Expressions in 2005. And more recently, there was the 2021 Windhoek +30 Declaration on Information as a Public Good in the Digital Age, which appears to state that all information is somehow public good. I don't quite understand. And then in 2022, they launched consultations on this notion of creating draft guidelines on social media platforms. And this process is moving, as Ellie indicated, very quickly. We're sort of in move fast, break things mode, it seems. So they had consultations last year, and then 2023 of this year, February, they had a big Internet for Trust meeting in Paris to discuss the second iteration of the guidelines and received many comments and are now preparing a version 3 that is expected to drop next week at World Press Freedom Day, which probably won't be that different from version 2, but we'll see. And I gather it's hoped that they will conclude this whole process within the next half year or so. You're talking about an international agreement of potentially quite significant impact on the global media landscape being launched, created, negotiated, and finalized within the scope of a year, which is fairly breathtaking. The guidelines are very broad in scope in terms of the issues and actors covered. They have a strong kind of focus on social media harms and regulatory responses. They advance a uniform global framework applicable to highly variable national political systems. You know, if the world was made up of liberal democracies, the rules might look different, but it's not. And there's 5 organizing principles that they set out and then say, okay, how will these be implemented by governments, regulators, platforms, intergovernmental organizations, and stakeholders. So it's a very ambitious initiative. It's potentially very significant. So it's important to broaden the debate, and that's why we're here. So to explore all this, we've got a panel of leading expert participants in the discussion, all of whom were in Paris. We have Alison Gilwald. Alison's the Executive Director of Research ICT Africa, RIA, a digital policy and regulatory think tank based in South Africa. RIA did the background paper for the Paris meeting of UNESCO, and Alison was a speaker there, as was David. And Alison's a longtime telecom internet expert, been around for a while with all of us, and also an adjunct professor at the University of Cape Town's Nelson Mandela School of Public Governance. David Kay is a clinical professor of law and director of the International Justice Clinic at the University of California, Irvine. He's also the chair of the board of directors of the Global Network Initiative, a multi-stakeholder initiative that brings together 85 leading businesses, NGOs, and academics on digital speech issues and related matters. From 2014 to 2020, David served as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of expression and opinion and expression, sorry. It's a long term, David. Anyway, but David was the author of some very important reports that were the subject of extended debate among many governments and other actors over the past decade. So it's great to have him here. And Laura O'Brien. Laura is the Senior UN Advocacy Officer at Access Now, a prominent global NGO that advocates for digital civil rights and organizes the annual RightsCon convention. Previously, Laura engaged in strategic litigation support, including at the Inter-American Court of Human Rights and for various human rights organizations, including the UN Special Rapporteurs. So the mechanics are that I'll pose, basically around 4 broad questions to the panel. We'll do tour of the table and go around, and then we'll open it up to hopefully broad and inclusive and dynamic discussion a bit later, closer to the hour. So, okay, that's where we're going, what we're doing. So let's start with the panel. And again, thanks everybody. So let's start with the existential question. Why are we here? How did we get here? What is the political market demand for these international guidelines? I mean, who wants them or not, and why? Why guidelines rather than some alternative model of international governance that might be available, interstate kind of obligations or soft declarations and so on? I mean, guidelines are a specific sort of thing. So let's talk a little bit about what's gotten us here and what they're trying to achieve. Which of the panelists would like to kick off that conversation? Anybody?
I guess I'll say a couple of words first, if that's all right.
Sure.
So I just want to sort of situate what UNESCO is doing and maybe put the UNESCO effort in some institutional context. I mean, my view is that the outcome so far has been wanting. I'm not that happy with it, but backing up a little bit, this is a space that UNESCO has been involved in for many years, and the fact is, under the leadership of its previous director for freedom of expression and media, Guy Berger, UNESCO commissioned and did just a whole lot of really valuable work around media resilience, around disinformation, around protection of journalists, safety of journalists, around misogyny in the media, both traditional media and social media. So it's not as if UNESCO has sort of suddenly waltzed into a crowded ballroom and, I don't want to push this metaphor too far, but, sort of taken over the scene. I mean, this is a place that UNESCO has been involved in for a long time. And there's nothing, to my mind, there's nothing unnatural about UNESCO caring about this space and being involved in this space. The bigger question, I think, which as Bill and Ellie, as you both sort of set up, is sort of what's the demand, what's the need right now for guidance to states, what is actually needed within the international community in order to ensure that, as you know, as Bill, as you laid out, as we're entering this very kind of dynamic regulatory space with, you know, not just the Digital Services Act in the European Union, but kind of a rash of really, I mean, sorry to put a fine point on it, but idiotic laws at the state level in the United States. You know, in the midst of all of this, there, you know, what is needed? What is needed to say to states, you know, if you're going to regulate social media, which, by the way, is regulating speech, whether you think of, you know, the companies themselves as speakers, or whether you think of their users as ultimately the ones who will be kind of subject of these regulations, what's needed in this space? And I mean, I think that's, I won't answer that. I'll stop here because I'd like to hear what Allison and Laura say and think about this, you know, as we get into it. But I think, to me, the question is, so in this environment, what's needed? What are the principles that need to be expressed? Who needs to be a part of that process? What should that process look like? Those are the initial questions that I think, you know, where the kind of criticism of the UNESCO process has been both substantive and process oriented. And I think that might lead us into kind of a rich discussion here about, well, what would we like to see in its place, or how would we like to see these evolve?
Thanks, David. Allison or Laura, whichever of you would like to jump in.
Yeah.
Sure, go ahead, Laura. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just first want to start off by thanking CITI and Columbia Business School for inviting me to this discussion. And I really appreciate how David reframed the question again, getting back to, you know, what's needed, what are the principles? And for those who couldn't attend the Paris conference back in February, there was an interesting fireside chat with the Assistant Director General for Communications and Information of UNESCO, as well as Andrew Pudafat, the Senior Consultant for UNESCO. And they really did dive into this question head on about why UNESCO, why were they bringing this initiative? So I definitely encourage you to check that out if you haven't seen it. And Gillespie really mentioned 4 main reasons as to why UNESCO felt it should initiate a global dialogue on what we see today as the UNESCO guidelines. But the point that I want to raise, and in that, he also talked about the Rome principles, which have been mentioned in the chat, the Windhoek +30 declaration, which Bill mentioned. So really kind of showcasing, you know, the track on how we got here today. And it's really a compelling justification for how this was part of UNESCO's mandate. But it's true that multilateral institutions such as UNESCO, when they're doing initiatives in partnership with civil society, with other stakeholders, they can play an important role in advancing rights respecting regulatory guidelines, so long as they center on human rights, they reduce risks, and they encompass meaningful consultation at the onset. And that's one of the main concerns we've been having at Access Now with this initiative. It must center on human rights. And like many civil society, we view it's imperative to cooperate with others. So, you know, getting back to David's question on who needs to be a part of this process, I think it's really important to note that the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, in any efforts to establish global guidelines of the sort that's envisioned by UNESCO, must encompass those agencies, those underlying principles, because really UNESCO has a more restricted mandate when it comes to overseeing state obligations under the ICCPR compared to OHCHR, who has, you know, encompasses the relevant expertise and the guidance and initiative, as well as, you know, other initiatives within their portfolio, such as the BTEC project, which is relevant, the Rabat Plan of Action, the Istanbul process. So this was something that we really tried to push forward in our initial submission to UNESCO on draft 1.1, and I think is really, you know, part of the discussion today. And then if I may just quickly go back to Bill's initial question, you know, I think it's important, you know, back in November 2022, you know, this initiative kind of came out of nowhere and we were all asking, like, where was this coming from? Like, what purpose does this serve? And I say initiative because I think we need to address the elephant in the room that this was not first established as the guidelines that we are discussing today. It was initially drafted as a regulatory framework and model legislation. And on that, I do want to give a shout out to Article 19, who was one of the first civil society organizations to really submit comments to UNESCO and outlining the deep concerns that I think we're going to dive in today. So.
Thanks, Laura. That was really helpful. Alison?
Thanks very much, Bill. So I suppose without being too repetitive, I did want to reiterate the long tradition that UNESCO has here beyond science and education, which I'm sure Ellie must have been saying partially tongue in cheek, because he did refer to the New World Information Order. And I think for many people in the global south, or in non-aligned movement, or people who feel marginalized from these networks and these platforms, this is seen as part of that kind of tradition. So although it's only very briefly mentioned, and we often don't mention it enough, this framework that we're speaking about is actually only pertains to less than half the world at the moment, because we have this massive people who are not online. So really those fundamental issues that the New World Information Order was dealing with 30, 40 years ago now, can't remember, but are very much the same issues we're dealing today. And also around the issues of the sort of challenges to multilateralism, and the extremely that there is no normative consensus, that we're trying to build these frameworks in a situation where we can no longer assume, we obviously have to assume those human rights and those things, because that's why we can't hold the document together. But there isn't normative consensus on that, in the ways even that there were possibly around the New World Information Order and certain things around that. So things around freedom of expression, etc. There are vast parts of the internet now that are controlled by countries and jurisdictions that there is no respect for this. And there's a lot of countries who've historically sort of sat in between and are signatories to international human rights conventions, but are actually very comfortable with practices, Chinese merit systems and things that operate through the internet on those systems. So I think it's a very important time to have this conversation. I think there's a lot of pressure from a lot of different places that are when I say smaller countries, less developed countries, possibly without the kind of capacity to regulate or make the demands either in the same frame or in a different frame than the European Union is able to make, and have also, of course, pushed back against that becoming the standard for everybody. But I think there is a strong sense that the challenges that we're facing now around misinformation and disinformation disorder at a global level are no longer, you're no longer able to address those through national institutional arrangements, and that the issues of global cooperation that were referred to, and the challenges that we face around that are extremely, extremely pertinent. And so I think the framing of this as a guidance document, going back to the discussion of why is it that and not something else, and why we collectively, the universe, globe, people in the globe, are able to move on this so quickly, or UNESCO is anyway, is precisely because it's a very meant to be a very high level principle document, and that's part of the challenge, because as soon as you take that principle on the ground, there are enormous challenges of implementation. These democratic assumptions that I was speaking about, and we're making demands for certain things online that don't even exist offline. We're making quite onerous institutional capability demands, assuming the institutional endowments in countries that don't exist in many countries. And yet we've got this problem of needing to realize what I think you were skeptically referring to as digital public goods, to make those realized at the national level. That in fact, that kind of domestication, that kind of implementation only occurs. And I think it's not impossible. There's a sense that, we can't get some kind of cross-jurisdictional thing. And I'm not talking about world regulation of this, but I do think we need some kind of cooperative mechanism that will allow the enforcement of, harmful information to be, big tech, etc., are compelled to act on those. So yeah, I think there is a big demand from very, very many quarters for this.
Thanks, Alison. That's really helpful. Just to clarify my own view of that, the public goods aspect, there's certainly information that is a public good. My question is whether all information is public good, but that's another matter. But I think what's Laura made the point, and this is, I think, kind of goes directly to what I was asking about. It sounds like this is an initiative that came from UNESCO itself. Am I correct in that? That they felt that their member states, particularly the Global South, as Alison suggested, would value an intervention here. So it wasn't like a coalition of states came to UNESCO and said, please do this. Is that correct?
My understanding is that it's an initiative of the Director General, and others could correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, I would look, all agencies of the UN and all international actors, at a moment of kind of, dynamic discussions around regulation, all, want to have a piece of it in a way. They want to participate. And I think, I don't know if states actually were pushing UNESCO to do this. I wouldn't be surprised if some European states or states that are going through very similar kind of, regulatory discussions like Brazil, we're pushing for something like this, not necessarily to have global standards, but to have something that reinforces what they're already doing or they want to do. Anyway, but that's, I think, a little bit speculation on my part. It's not totally clear what the motivation behind it was. Okay,
thanks, David. So the fact that we're speculating about drivers and initiatives raises some questions about the legislative history. And I just, before we get to the content of the thing, I would just like to talk a little bit more about the sort of the process aspect, the institutional locus. I mean, UNESCO has put itself forward as the place for a global framework discussion here. One could argue it could have been done in a human rights context or a truly multi-stakeholder setting, et cetera, but UNESCO's taken the bit in the teeth and said, we're going to go forward. And they want to provide, they say, a multi-stakeholder platform to address social media issues. Those of us who've been heavily involved in real multi-stakeholder processes might have some questions about that. So I guess I'm wondering, how do people feel about the process going forward? Has it been sufficiently inclusive and transparent and so on? I mean, I know, for example, I mean, Laura said that it was initially drafted as a regulatory framework and model legislation. As far as I can tell, you cannot find on the UNESCO website any legislative history. You can't find the earlier versions of the guidelines. You can't find any of the submissions that were made by the different parties. So I'm a little puzzled about how this open multi-stakeholder process is working, but maybe people can help me. So how does the institutional locus here matter to the way this process is unfolding? Anybody? Laura, perhaps you could take the lead on that.
Yeah, certainly. I think, this point on transparency has been one of the main critiques and criticisms, not only on the substance of it, but also procedurally as well. And since the onset of this process, there has been insufficient publicly available information on the guidelines or the approach UNESCO has taken. I think that's already come up to fruition today in today's conversation. Not enough information on the website. There's also been issues on, even like the publication of the guidelines have been only in English and French, not in Spanish. So, language barriers that have made it limited for certain civil society, certain other stakeholders in different regions to sufficiently contribute. And also noting it's a UN initiative, the importance of ensuring that this is transparent in multiple languages. So that's an important a criticism that was at the onset of the guidelines. And it also remains unclear like which and how many stakeholders UNESCO has engaged with during the process, like who contributed to the first draft guidelines. Like unlike other UN affiliations or other UN processes, you can usually access and see the different submissions that stakeholders have made. And the problem with this is that, someone could make a sweeping generalization that civil society is in disagreement on certain aspects or certain issues, but we won't have knowledge of that or transparency unless we're actually speaking with other civil society organizations and speaking with each other to get a better sense of what positions we've been putting forward and what critiques we've been making. So I think, and another thing that's also been a frustration on the transparency point is that there's been, these quick turnarounds. The version 1.1 was published in November, December of 2022. This is obviously a very busy time for a lot of us. And then 1 month ahead of the global conference, there was another iteration. So, it's definitely been frustrating, I think, especially given the overall outlook to achieve this process in 1 year, to not have sufficient transparency on it. However, on the flip side, positively, we can now say that this process is no longer a secret or known by the insiders of this space. And we strongly recommend that UNESCO use RightsCon, which was previously mentioned in the introduction, which Access Now leads and is one of the largest convenings on the future of the internet, to advance the efforts to hammer out some of the consensus, the rough consensus, building legitimacy for this process, get more interaction with stakeholders, especially stakeholders from the global majority and civil society that has largely been ignored.
Thanks, Laura. So we're doing a process about communication, access to information, these kinds of issues, and the process is not completely open and transparent. So this a little bit of irony. David or Allison, what thoughts about the institutional setting and process so far? Whichever of you would like to go.
Allison?
Go ahead, David.
Well, I mean, I would only echo what Laura was saying. I mean, I do want to go back to what UNESCO sort of is and does. And also, I think the process is related to the output or the outcome here. I mean, the final document here isn't going to be, and I don't think was ever intended to be, an international agreement, right? I mean, there's no, I don't think, although I guess there's some opacity around this too, but I don't think there was any intention that states would somehow sign on to this as a kind of binding set of norms that they would then apply in their own places. That wasn't the goal. And so there's definitely room for UNESCO, or frankly for any UN agency or organization to put out into the public its view of a particular area that needs to be subject to domestic regulation or maybe human rights driven principles, whatever it might be. I mean, this is all within the scope of UNESCO's work, but the problem I think here is that it was just really unclear as to whether what they were trying to do was kind of commission something that would be that would provide kind of regulatory guidance, in which case if they just did it and put it out there, maybe fine. But I think there was an ambition that at least seemed to people on the outside that there was more than the usual just UNESCO report, which could be helpful as part of a debate, but more like, here's what the rules should be. And I think it was that move from kind of researchy and kind of really guidance oriented approaches to something that looked a little bit more directive to states that put people off. And it's the closer you get to something that's directive, the more you need an open process that involves real clarity from the very beginning. And I think Laura was alluding to this. There was clearly some kind of concern around the first several months of this because it was unclear, it was entirely opaque. I think UNESCO has tried to retool. That doesn't mean that the outcome is going to be great, and we can talk about the substance as well. But I think that sort of, as far as like process leading to substance, I think that maybe frames it a little bit for us too.
It does. Thank you. Allison?
Yeah, so I really don't have any kind of inside track on this. Having just really done background research on the side of it. But I think from September have been involved in various things. UNESCO has tried to have consultations at IGF, at various multi-stakeholder forums, trying to get people, getting us, I think, Access Now and us were on their panels at IGF. So I think there has been an attempt to kind of open up that multi-stakeholder space. I think this is precisely the challenges of trying to move quite quickly and try and build consensus within the UN system. Mm-hmm. And so I think if it was going to be a directive, it would have had to go through the member state process. And I think it's no secret that is quite a closed process for many people. Even if UNESCO keeps that open, many member states, they're not multi-stakeholder. They're only the government representative there, and they will try and direct stuff in certain ways. So in a way, not having a formal binding agreement, which I think many felt anyway, that it was kind of impossible to do. It's so kind of unenforceable. How do you actually make this work other than through some kind of voluntary cooperation? That it actually lends itself more to that type of guidance, which I think many of us were saying, well, what is that guidance to whom, when, how, how does this actually work? Because I think there is a sense, Bill, from some people, and I know many of us in terms of recommendations have reiterated the need for multi-stakeholder processes and the transparency and accountability that goes with that, is that, our experience in other areas of multi-stakeholderism and multi-stakeholder governance is actually, they talk shops. They're not places that make decisions and get things done. And this is actually a very important issue. It can't be dealt with by another talk shop that doesn't actually have any teeth. So I think important to distinguish between the kind of multi-stakeholder process that's required and then actually what is coming out of this. And at the moment, it is just guidance to nations as I read it. But I think there are people who are saying, well, this might actually not be enough to address these problems. And so looking at, European Union and UK and various people who are putting, transparency and accountable regulation into force.
Right. Okay. You guys who've been involved in this, are the platforms themselves much discussed, much involved in the process? Do they have a lot of representation in Paris and other parts of the process thus far? Do we know?
I mean, it hasn't been obvious if that's happening. I mean, for anybody who was in Paris, I wonder, the tone was really striking. It was sort of like pitchforks are out for platforms. That might have been the subtitle of the conference. I mean, it was really, it's just, the vibe is very anti-platform, and that's, fine. I mean, there's obviously a lot that the platforms should be doing better, but I see Henriette is suggesting that they've been actively involved, and I think that's probably a good thing, but it hasn't been entirely evident from the public side.
Okay.
Just to say, I think it was the lack of kind of very visible presence, sitting on a lot of the platform discussion, not those platforms, but a lot of the session panels and those kinds of things. There was at various points people made a point that they weren't as present as they thought they should be in those conversations. Just to say from my own experience on these sorts of things, I mean, I'm sure all of the panels at this kind of level of thing, this kind of level of engagement would make themselves available. And I certainly saw people from everybody there, although not on all the panels. But there's also, platforms have also been taking cover. And, I've had a number of things recently that I can't actually get platforms to that they have been. So possibly, David, because of the kind of pitchfork sense of things. But I think they certainly, I think it is a response to two platforms. In that sense, I think there is a tension. Certainly, there was a very strong tension, but I don't think they've been excluded or
Okay.
yeah, from the process.
All right, so thanks, Alison. So then let's talk a bit about the substantive content of the thing. I outlined at the beginning. There are these 5 principles, and then it specifies how different actors should, what roles they should play in implementing them, and so on. And a number of parties, I mean, those documents that are available are in particular statements from NGOs like Access Now and Global Network Initiative and so on, providing input, Article 19, etc., providing input. I don't have access to any of the governmental statements or any inputs from the platforms themselves. But looking at what's been said, it seems that there have been a number of concerns raised about the scope of the entities that would be covered, what platforms are we talking about the scope of issues that would be covered, whether you should have questions of electoral integrity being covered in an instrument like this, whether there should be more of a human rights baseline for this discussion, whether there shouldn't be greater attention to questions of digital privacy and data protection, competition policy, these kinds of issues, whether the kind of focus on harmful and illegal content isn't potentially lending itself towards some abuse. So if I could just have some top line feedback from you all who were there, what are your main views on the substantive thrust of the guidelines at present and concerns about what they're putting forward? Who would like to lead us off there? David, would you like to? You've written about this, so.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'd also really like to hear what Alison and Laura think about them. I mean, so the first thing I'd say is that the guidelines have they've improved. I mean, they're getting better, which to me is a signal that, you know, when you kind of open source, when you have a multi-stakeholder process, you know, you allow the flaws to be evident and to be addressed. So there's sort of a trajectory where they're getting better. But I would say that, like, my main concern is that guideline. I think there's a way in which guidelines can be very useful for some countries. You know, for some countries that in good faith really want to do the right thing and may not have the resources for a variety of reasons to develop their own regulatory regime, sort of, you know, from the ground up. In that context, guidelines can be really useful for those kinds of countries. The problem is that each country has its own, you know, regulatory regime, its own tradition, its own sort of governmental organization. That means that, you know, how you address, you know, whatever's considered a harm online really is going to vary. And so as a substantive matter, I mean, I think it would have been, and I think we're well beyond this at this point, but I think it would have been much better for UNESCO, maybe in collaboration with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, for example, to come up with a list of principles, you know, much briefer and much more, you know, obviously from the beginning rooted in human rights standards of freedom of expression. And, you know, Ellie mentioned human rights standards at the very beginning in his introduction of, you know, this webinar. And I think there's actually a lot of, you know, very powerful and meaningful principles that come out of the human rights system, both in terms of the guarantees for freedom of expression. And for those who aren't familiar, and I think Article 19 was mentioned before, not the organization, but, you know, the provision of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is, you know, the central civil and political rights treaty in international law, it protects everyone's right to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers and through any media. That's almost a direct quote. And the beauty of that provision is that it protects and promotes the rights of speakers, but also the rights of audiences to access information. And then Article 19 provides basically a narrow set of standards, a narrow set of limitations that states may apply to freedom of expression. And I think that a set of principles that really restated how, the internet and social media have, but I would say really more generally, the internet and search, perhaps more than social, have really advanced access to information and how important it is to protect and promote that, putting that up front, and then highlighting, like, these are the limitations on the state's ability to restrict that right. And that includes social media regulation. And I would have reframed it that way and made a short document that states could all look to as a guiding set of principles, rather than a lengthy regulatory document, which you kind of end up with now. Now, again, they've moved in a better direction, I think, over the last few months, and we'll see what the third version looks like. But I would have started with that more, general, but also human rights rooted kind of agenda than the one that they started with.
Thanks. That's really, I think, important to work from the baseline of human rights considerations here. And as I said in the chat, I'd like to hear more about what the rights of users are in this context, because it seems to be very much focused on regulation of the platforms in a narrow kind of way. All right, so Allison or Laura, whichever of you would like to, main considerations about the content of the thing as of now?
Yeah, I just want to come in to echo David's points and raise 2 points as well. I agree with the framing it from a guidelines to a declaration of principles. And this is something we actually pushed for at Access Now in our second submission on the more recent version that we see, because from our understanding, like, a declaration would enable UNESCO and states to advance crucial international human rights law, which David pointed to, but also accountability commitments, while also acknowledging the existing complexities surrounding the context-dependent regulatory challenge of measures of online speech. And I think that leads to the second point I want to reiterate that David was raising, which is the application of this initiative in other contexts. The creation of a guidance which aims to be global in scope and application requires, a diligent assessment of online information ecosystems, an understanding of the current regulatory models in various jurisdictions and the salient human rights risks associated with different content governance models, including self-regulation, co-regulation, and state regulation. And my colleagues in the MENA and LATAM regions were specifically concerned that in authoritarian and non-democratic contexts, the language about state regulation of digital platforms might open the door wide open for abuse and encourage further restrictions on the rights not only to freedom of expression and opinion, but also the right to privacy and a host of other fundamental rights and freedoms enabled and enjoyed through the use of social media platforms. So we thought that the guidance, the version 1.1, really failed to encompass these regional considerations, and that was probably a result of not having proper consultation with people in those regions. But I think, as David highlighted and others have pointed out, we do see that UNESCO has taken some concrete steps to make them more robust, and we really wanted to call for a reality check on this initiative. And then finally, just to cap off this intervention on this point, I think consulting with civil society who are based in these regions is essential. And at Access Now, we actually co-authored a declaration of principles, which is what we're trying to get UNESCO to move forward to. But those principles were focused on content and platform governance in times of crises. And this effort was really to advance consistent and rights-respecting principles for companies to respond appropriately to crises and meet their obligations and responsibilities under international human rights law. And these are the very issues that we have, and I'll post it in the chat, but this declaration is the exact issues that UNESCO needs to be mindful of and that UNESCO should address.
Thank you very much for that, Laura. So I'd like to go to opening it to the floor, but I just
Bill,
want to get,
can I just say one thing?
yeah,
on
sure,
the
Nelson, go ahead.
Sorry, on the framing, I'll let you open the floor because I see we are running on. So I suppose just a few things about the document and in response to David and Laura's points. So I suppose, David, the concern with working with the appropriate rights organizations and framing this more clearly in the rights framework. If you look at the original guidelines and the intention of the document, it's very explicitly that this is to be a rights preserving guideline, that does these kinds of things. So it's very much there in the mandate and the rhetoric of the document. And I'm sure you're speaking about giving it some of the substance that it would need from that. I just wanted to add to that, and this is our response, RIA's response, not the kind of background response to the document, is that, a lot of the discussions around the data governance and the content side, firstly, as I said, they're really serious challenges around assumptions that everyone has access to this and that everyone has the capabilities to manage those harms, even individually as audiences. Bill, to go to your point, that if it requires a certain amount of media literacy or digital literacy to identify misinformation, or if it's understanding the procedures for takedown notices or whatever it is. This is not an evenly applied human rights system that's at work there. And of course, those principles should be there. But I think what a whole body of our work is trying to do is actually to really return to some of those New World Information Order issues, but actually really highlight the importance of obviously safeguarding the first generation rights, the fundamental rights, the privacy and the freedom of expression rights. These are core to what these issues are, but really also understanding the structural inequalities that make it very difficult for people to exercise these rights effectively, and acknowledging the need for the realization of second and third generation rights, of economic rights, so that people can be participating in the system effectively, and in the diversity and plurality of ideas that are there, and realizing that many of the people who are unable to do that are sitting in countries that do not necessarily safeguard those rights. So I think just in terms of the rights framing, absolutely critical, but I do think there's a need to extend it from these quite individualized notions of rights, then quite individualized notions of process in rectifying or remedying things, with the takedown procedures, with the oversight procedures. These are very individualized rights. There's not much attention paid to issues of collective rights and interests. So I think that's one of the kind of important things in the framing of this, so that it is going to be realized all. And then the other is that around this issue of it, yes, in a sense, we don't want it more to be more than principles, because firstly, that would require a whole more complicated process. And also that, if it is that, it has all the potential to be abused and misused if it's, down to you may regulate and do this by certain states. And we certainly have to safeguard against that. But I think, for it to be useful in terms of your question of, who prompted this, and did the Director General just wake up one morning and say, okay, we've got to do it. I mean, I think there's obviously a lot of pressure from civil society and people who are being unable to be effective in getting misinformation or content regulation that they may feel is required underway. So I think this is, people are going to be looking for something more than principles if this is going to be able to do anything. In a sense, we have those human rights principles there and in place. So is it just about the application to the platform environment that we need guidance on, or is it actually something that will really allow us to create these mechanisms of global cooperation that we'll need to be effective, to change things? And so I suppose just my last point, which captures a whole lot of these things, is that at the moment it's still addressing with regulatory models, different regulatory models, and of course we will need multiple going forward. There's not going to just be one that works at the moment, and there are very big problems with the definitions of co-regulation and stuff that I think can be addressed quite easily in the document. But I think broadly what is really important is that if we're going to address this, we have to address it systemically, not on this kind of individualized case-by-case kind of oversight board kind of company basis. And those systemic things is really would be the enormous contribution of this kind of document, if it could actually say, we're not going to address these overnight, but systemically we have to deal with this. And that means not only dealing with content regulation, we have to be looking at algorithmic governance, data regulation, these recommender algorithms that are actually perpetuating the content, misinformation and those kinds of things. But even more broadly than that, we've got to be looking at competition law, we've got to be looking at intellectual property law. It has to be systemically addressed, otherwise it's not going to make any difference.
Understood. That was really helpful, Alison. Let me press you on one point before we open to everybody. Just you'd raised the possibility of misuse of guidelines, and this is something I wonder about. I mean, the guidelines are saying, governments, please create these regulatory mechanisms and have them do this and this and that and that and that. And do, focus on harmful content and etc. And if we were talking about a world of liberal democracies, as I said at the outset, maybe some of this would not seem dicey, but we're not. We're talking about a world of 190 something countries, many of which are non-democratic. And so I wonder if you guys could just address before we open to everybody, is there a risk here of the guidelines providing international legitimacy and support for non-democratic governments to penalize and suppress different types of speech? Is there a risk that the regulatory agencies and frameworks that would be created in order to implement this could go a little off the rails? And there's a lot of talk in the document about the broadcast regulation, which I found wasn't quite sure how that related. So could you guys just address that briefly, and then we'll go to everybody. Who'd like to chomp on that? David.
Okay. I go back and forth on this question. I don't think the risk of some states taking the wrong lessons or abusing the guidelines or using the guidelines but imposing them in a system that doesn't have like an independent judiciary, for example. I don't think that's a reason not to do the guidelines. I do think it's a reason to be particularly careful about how you define certain things. So for example, in an earlier version, there was discussion about illegal content. And, in human rights law, there's no such thing as illegal content. I mean, there's content that can be prohibited, incitement, hate speech that constitutes incitement to violence, for example. But generally speaking, the question isn't what is illegal under human rights law, but it is, what is the extent to which the state can restrict speech, expression, whether it's restricting a speaker or an audience. And so I think that because of that risk of taking those kinds of terms and expansively using those to restrict speech, the guidelines need to be especially careful. But I don't think there's some fundamental reason. I mean, this was a big argument around the German regulation, NetzDG, for example, where, NetzDG, which, basically imposed some very significant and onerous requirements on platforms that were related to German law, essentially, putting the platforms in the position of being adjudicators, which was deeply problematic. There's been a lot of discussion about how that law has been kind of copy pasted into authoritarian environments, and that's absolutely true, and that should be a concern, and that should be a concern here. But it's not some fundamental bar to putting out what the principles should be if an agency wants to do that. That's my view on this.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I see people are already looking to jump in. Did you, Laura and Alison, did you have anything quick on this point, or should I just open it to the floor and we can circle back to this issue in the context of discussion? Okay, let's do that then. So, because I see Eldie's got his hand up, and hopefully we have other people on in the webinar too, who I hope will be willing to jump into the discussion, some of whom were in Paris and have been closely involved. So please, anybody who wants to jump in, Eldie, you've got your hand, so go ahead.
Thank you. This was extraordinarily interesting, extraordinarily informative, and good perspectives, good views, well informed. And my own 4 or 5 questions were addressed with one exception, and that I'd like to raise, which is, I mean, suppose the process works itself out and we get all this transparency and everything that people had asked for, but we still, the fundamental principle that these guidelines pursue is to put the responsibility of cleaning up the act of content to the platforms. And at the same time, as David said, kind of the Paris meeting was kind of pitchforks against the platforms. So we're concerned about the platforms, and therefore we want to give them more power, more authority, more responsibility over content, not just nationally, but really globally. That is the fundamental contradiction that I don't grasp. And so if we get that, and Facebook, Meta, and the others kind of do put in thousands and tens of thousands of people in charge of what is disinformation and what is fact and what is fiction, have we actually gained anything, or are we actually going back into giving corporate entities enormous information power, something that they truly cannot, even if they're well-meaning and not profit-oriented, but realistically, they will end up being over-regulating, over-restricting. People will get upset and everybody will say these big platforms, American, by the way, are controlling the world again.
Thanks, Ellie. There are other people who've got their hands up or who are at least sending me messages in the chat indicating interest in talking. So if folks could put their hands up so I could see them, or else put a question into the chat that I can read, either way. Henriette Esterhuizen from South Africa, please join us. Henriette.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thanks to you and Ellie for convening these fantastic seminars. And I see that Guilherme from UNESCO has also joined us, so you could also actually hear from UNESCO itself. I just wanted to make a few remarks. I think that firstly, this is an important initiative. This is a conversation that's a good conversation to be had. But I do share the concerns that's been expressed by Laura in particular and by David. Alison, my question to you is, address what? Yes, there's a need to address these systemic issues, but I think that my concern is, can they be addressed effectively by these guidelines? And what I see here is the context is, on the one hand, misinformation panic. I think the world is, and particularly governments, are just have gone into overdrive with concern about dis and misinformation. And of course, it's a serious problem, but we have enough evidence already to show that legislative responses don't work. I've just done some research on Africa, and whether they are misinformation laws or other laws that have clauses to deal with misinformation, they're not achieving that objective. They're not getting the bad information off the internet. What they are doing is restricting speech and limiting what journalists can do. Then I think the second thrust here is the platforms and pitchforks, concern. I think there is a sense that these platforms, these companies are too powerful. They need to be regulated. They need to be held accountable and be more transparent. And I think UNESCO has done good work on that as well. And I share that concern, but I think that's a separate issue, and it needs to be addressed through market regulation, maybe through building on some of the work that Ranking Digital Rights has done. I don't think that you should mix that with anything that touches content, because the moment you start regulating content, as David said right at the beginning, you do end up regulating speech. And then I think finally, Alison, I just wanted to respond. You said there's no consensus on norms. I think we do have normative consensus. The fact that many states break those norms doesn't mean we don't have those norms. And I'm not sure that the guidelines will make them even, any more compliant with international human rights laws than they are at the moment. So I think, but I do have norms, and I think we do have norms, and I think one of the strengths of the guidelines are that they that they really do affirm those international human rights norms around content. And then finally, Bill, I think what also concerns me is that there's a bit of a distraction factor here. I feel that it's making regulatory agencies, I'm talking about Africa specifically, information regulators, they're dealing with data protection regulation, they're dealing with freedom of information legislation. They've got a lot on their plate. Telecoms regulators are still dealing with affordable access. And it just concerns me that they're going to move and channel resources and time into regulation that could actually end up affecting content, affecting freedom of speech, and at the expense of actually being more proactive, more positive. Media literacy. I mean, media literacy is incredibly important. And then I think just one more point and then I'll stop. I also feel that we, and not just UNESCO, I think we're all assuming that the platform industry, that social media as it exists today is going to continue to exist as it does today. And there's absolutely no reason to make that assumption. We just have to look at Twitter and how Twitter has changed, in the last few months, to look at, to keep in mind that this is a moving target. And if we're going to try and address misbehavior by platforms, bad content online, we need to find more long-term, long-lasting, and maybe simpler ways of doing that.
Thanks, Henriette. That was wonderful. Why don't, Alison, there were a few points to you directly, but why don't we take more questions and then we kind of address, do responses around the back end. We have somebody here from UNESCO. If you'd like to weigh in, that'd be really, really helpful. Are you able to take the mic or?
Hello, everyone. I'm Guilherme Canella, as many of you know, and I'm the overall coordinator of this process in UNESCO. Unfortunately, I just heard about this event a few moments ago, but I was following lively before joining the Zoom call. I think that maybe it's more useful if you want to get more questions, and maybe at I think I would be very glad to receive the recordings of this, because this is also an interesting input for the consultations we are doing. Of course, so I could clarify some points that you were discussing before. And as I said, I was listening and seeing that are more factual things that someone said, for instance, that we only have things in English and French. That's not true. From the beginning, the guidelines were available in Spanish, for instance, and how it started and things like that. But regarding on the content issues that Henriette just discussed, or David raised, or Laura and Alison, this is part of what we are consulting. So although we might, as UNESCO, have some disagreements of things that were said here, and of course Henriette knows because we have been discussing that, I actually now would be more glad in listening all those different viewpoints, because we are precisely in the moment of adjusting these elements through the consultations. However, as I said, if more towards the end you prefer me to clarify more the factual issues regarding this process, I'm glad to do it.
Fantastic. Well, that's much appreciated. And if anybody has any points that they want to pose to you directly.
Yeah, I think we should hear a little bit more, not about the process, but about the principles themselves and how you see yourself, how these things should work themselves out and why you're doing this.
You're asking me? Okay.
Do you want me to go now, or yes, sure.
Go ahead, please.
Look, as we think, but maybe we are wrong, that this is very detailed in the way we communicated the process in the dedicated online space for that. But our general conference, who asked the Secretariat of UNESCO to provide guidance to our member states on how to address different issues related to the digital ecosystem, commenting, for instance, the problems that were mentioned here: disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, how these things are affecting elections, but also in a broader perspective, the transparency of the internet companies. All the 193 member states of UNESCO approved, for instance, the Windhoek Plus 30 declaration, who asked for issues such as media literacy, transparency, etc. So the let's say, the issue behind this is a demand for the Secretariat to produce whatever it is in terms of activities. Of course, the member states didn't set guidelines or an event or a workshop. They said, you need to address these issues through policy advice. And then on the World Press Freedom Day last year, May the 3rd in Uruguay, the Director General announced that one of the ways of addressing these was to convene a global discussion and a global consultation around these issues. And this is the process we are currently facing. The Secretariat produced a very initial version of a document that, as Laura said in the beginning, was mentioning the idea of a model regulatory framework, not a model law. Through the consultation processes and the comments we received, and that's the purpose of consulting, this was reframed as guidelines. But the principles, and as David also said, is the overall human rights international environment and how to discuss these things while protecting freedom of expression. But in a nutshell, the mandate came with concerns of the overall constituency of UNESCO on those issues that were mentioned before. How to address them is part of the consultation we are taking forward.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I don't want to drive too far into the process weeds on this, but only to share that there has been a concern about it, making the documents available so that everybody could track the legislative history and see what the different inputs are. I think, you guys could do that. That would help to allay any misconceptions that you may think are out there. Do we have other people who'd like to weigh in, though? I haven't had, I'm trying to keep an eye on the chat. I've seen several people making comments. Does anybody would like to make a comment, or otherwise, while you're gestating that, I can ask the panelists to speak. David Allen, go ahead. Hi, David.
Hi, Bill. Thanks. The conversation has proceeded, if I may be so bold as to suggest, on the grounds that freedom of expression is the dominant goal. That there are other concerns, but freedom of expression has to take precedence over everything. The U.S. has been a petri dish demonstrating how that's problematic. Social media has supercharged the capacity to effectively suborn very large segments of a population to create belief in that which is completely false. It's not the only factor, needless to say, but it is a central factor. If we're serious about some of the other considerations beyond freedom of speech, such as democracy and the rest of it, we're going to have to grapple with the tension here. We're going to have to sort out how it is that, amongst other things, this new technological marvel, social media, can be brought to effect not cult-like behavior amongst tens of millions of people, but the opposites that we need. And I invite this discussion to, beyond all the concerns about process and what UNESCO's done and the rest of it, get at that question, because until we deal with this, this tension, we're not going to have really useful things to say about what any UN body or others should do. And this, of course, takes note of all the authoritarian regimes who will try to misuse and so forth. Nonetheless, we've got to resolve this question of where freedom of speech fits in it. Allison pointed out collective concerns as well as individualistic concerns, and that is fundamental here. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Very helpful. Who else would like to jump in? Or can we get any other inputs from folks, or should I circle back to the panel to respond to things said so far? We've got another 12 minutes or so to go. All right, well, while people are percolating, let me just ask the panelists if you'd like to respond quickly to any of the points that have made, in particular, Allison, there were some points directed to you.
Sure, I can jump in first. So just to respond to some of the points that Henriette made. Yeah, I mean, when I said we've got to deal with this systemically, I did try to identify the multiple things that you'd have to deal with that in order to address systemic content issues, and that you would require, for example, probably the horse is bolted on a lot of this, but sort of adequate content regulation, adequate other forms of regulation that would allow for, opportunities. And I think broadly, there's a lot of the concern around the ability to regulate is, concerns that there've been over time around regulating content. It's not as if we've not had content regulation before, and especially outside of the US context. We have very extensive positive content regulation across many of the jurisdictions, Commonwealth jurisdictions historically, that have very positive regulatory, so positive discrimination, positive regulation around quotas and kinds of content and language content control. So there's a whole lot of content. The problem is that, in enforcing one's normative system or values in this global context, where you don't actually have control of those platforms through ordinary regulatory channels, means that one needs other forms of doing it. So there is the issue of harms, but as I said, dealing with the issues of harms will require global collaboration in order to deal with them. But there are also these very fundamental issues around, being able to exercise those rights and the extension of those rights to deal with some of the, collective systematic issues, structural inequalities, some of the things that David referred to as well. Those are not going to be dealt with purely, in the protection of freedom of expression, which is an important, very important consideration. And just the short answer to, is there a danger of countries abusing them? Absolutely. And as Henriette has said, already the misinformation has been used extensively against misinformation law coming out of COVID has been used extensively for non-COVID purposes and misinformation and curtailment of journalistic freedoms and personal freedoms. So absolutely, that's a problem. That is something that has to be guarded against. But I'm absolutely, I really need to stand behind David on, that can't stop us doing anything. So then we just default to what Ellie's just referred to as, basically the platforms being told they must just have this oversight and do it better. We're in a situation at the moment where the platforms are making decisions that were traditionally state decisions. These were not decisions that were just not made or something. It's not like they default. These are responsibilities to citizens that platforms have taken and have generally taken largely in their soul to avoid, further other forms of regulation, stronger forms of regulation. So I think we need to be careful of saying we can't do this because of the potential harms that might happen, and we have to continue to address those breaches where they're occurring off and online in those countries. So I mean, and it can be done. We can get this global collaboration. We've seen it, go horribly wrong, but actually continue to work around cybersecurity. It's in all our interests to get this to work somehow, something, and it goes bad and there's all sorts of problems with it, but it's kind of the best we've got and we need to kind of continue to work with it. It's these kinds of things that we're going to have to muddle our way through and find things that work and don't work. But as I say, I can't see how we can do this outside of global collaboration, which then we enforce at the national level. So I think those are the main points that I would like to make. Is that I think these issues are far too important for us to leave to either self-regulation, which has actually been solo regulation. This has been giant corporations making decisions about terms on which these are going to be regulated, the way this is going to be done, the resources that are going to be put to this, and these are digital public goods that need to be regulated in order to make them available and to protect people who are using them. as people have said, as you would with airlines and other global infrastructures, obviously content and language and freedom of speech does have a particular, deeper requirement, nuance in the regulation. But the regulation has to be able to, it has to be able to find ways of dealing with these, complex adaptive systems that old kind of fashioned, instrumental, quite stodgy regulation is simply not going to work, and mainly because that was primarily operated at a national level, and these are global challenges.
Thanks, Alison. Either of the two of you like to add something? Otherwise, I will pick up a few points in the chat.
Maybe I'll just add something, because David sort of presented this, I think, important dichotomy in a way of sort of the individual rights in the face of kind of social harm, and I think, or democratic harm, however you want to put it. And I thought it was a good way to put it, because I think we're all very alive to the fact that, democratic institutions are facing a lot of strain around the world right now. And so, and social media has played a part in all of that. So on the one hand, you can't kind of hide your head in the sand and avoid that big issue. But then it comes to the question of, how do you address that in regulation? What does that actually look like? And how do you do it in a way that doesn't open the door to over-regulation? And I mean, I think we also need to be kind of honest about regulation. Historically, most content regulation has become over-regulation. So, there's this phrase in one of the, I think in the second version, where it talks about a category of content that, quote, risks significant harm to democracy. And that's a big question. What does that exactly mean? And is that kind of phrase something that, even though in the democratic world we might say, oh yeah, we know what you're talking about, as a regulatory matter, that's not enough. And so what does it mean to define that? And I just don't know that, and it may be, and Guilherme may be able to help us understand how the process will, better define that. But even with clear definition, what does that really mean in terms of how states, again, that are looking for guidance can operationalize such a broad problem? And that is where, in the European context, it took them a couple of years with, significant hearings and trilogues and a whole lot of discussion of terms before they came up with the DSA. And the DSA, I think, is Alison, to reflect on what Alison was saying before, the DSA is only one element of a broader approach to this whole area, which also has to include consumer protection, competition policy, and so forth. So I, some very serious concerns around that, which may be resolved in the next version, but is just something that we should be, alive to.
Thanks, David. We're coming up towards the end of our time. Laura, do you have a last thought? And then I just wanted to flag a couple of things that were said in the chat.
Yeah, thanks. I'm mindful of time, so I don't want to echo what David and Alison said, more so on the substance, but just moving forward, I think, it's really glad to hear that the version 1.0 and 2.0 are going to be publicly available, and that all the comments received will be published. I think that will really help us going forward, as well as receiving version 3.0 ahead of World Press Freedom Day. So I think just going forward, really hoping that UNESCO can use the upcoming World Press Freedom Day and all of us working together on these issues to really ensure that we're seeking more input on the substance of the guidelines as they stand, particularly centering on civil society from those at-risk regions. So I just want to echo the opportunity for that and hope to and look forward to future contributions.
Thanks, Laura. I certainly agree. It's fundamental to running a multi-stakeholder process that the information all be readily accessible and everybody can be up to date with what's happening. I just wanted to flag that in the chat. We had some comments from Jacqueline Picato saying this is precisely the discussion we're having in Brazil with the bill for platforms, what constitutes an independent regulatory body? And there's a real question there about that. If we're encouraging the development of regulatory bodies or the repurposing of existing ones here. And there was a comment from Izan Khan saying, any thought on the recent proliferation of hostage-taking laws, i.e. governments forcing platforms to have local grievance officers who could be threatened with arrest if takedown orders, which could be global in nature, are not complied with? This is something the guidelines address or mention. And then there was another comment from Henriette as well, but just is there a 15-second response to either of those points that either of you, any of you could share? If not, I leave them out there as open questions because we're at 29 minutes after the hour. I thank you all very much for participating, the panelists. It was really, I think, very helpful and useful, and I hope useful to the folks who are with us from UNESCO as well. We're really looking forward to having more access to the information and ability to engage everybody in this process. Again, the last seminar in this webinar series for the semester will be Wednesday, May 24th at the same time. Topic is TBD, but the announcement will be sent out. So enough from me. Ellie, would you like to close?
Yeah, I will do so. First, to thank everybody, in particular Bill, for organizing it, for our three great panelists. I'm left with some skepticism here about the guidelines. I think that the danger is that they will give governments powers that will come to bite us. I fear that it will also give platforms actually powers of enforcement and restriction that will come to bite us. And even if I can live with those scenarios, the question is whether these laws will even be effective in accomplishing what they're trying to accomplish, because the players, after all, the ones who do try to sow disinformation and organize disinformation, they're not stupid either. They will find ways in which they will couch whatever they say in ways that will remain on those platforms. So I'm not particularly certain that this is the right direction to go, as well-meaning as it is. And so in addition to thanking everybody, let me just tell you that in another series of webinars, we will have on May the 4th, so in a few days, Shelley Palmer, a noted consultant with his own well-known blog, will speak about, quote, the intractable problem of alignment in AI, the intractable problem of alignment AI. How do you align the models to give you output aligned with human values? So that is somewhat related here by introducing the concept of AI into the human values into content. You will kind of, to connect this to the UN guidelines, they also talk about automated processes of monitoring and takedowns. So thank you very much, panel, again. And we'll see you. Bill's event is on May the 24th. Don't miss it. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.